people don't fear truth. When I talk to leaders all the time about defensiveness, they say, well, I don't want to give that person feedback because they just don't want to hear the truth. They can't handle the truth. People don't fear truth, they fear shame. And so when you approach accountability as a leader in a way that provokes shame, they disconnect. What that means is that the shame isn't just about them feeling like you despise them as their leader, but they start despising themselves. They start feeling overly guilty and shameful. That kind of emotion does not compel responsibility. It does not drive change. It drives resentment. It drives closing in on yourself. It makes people feel bad. So your job is connection through safety so that they can hear the truth and so they can take responsibility.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leadership. In this episode, we'll talk about how to deal with challenging people at work. Most every organization has them. The chronic underperformer everyone tiptoes around. The colleague whose broken promises go unaddressed. The coworker whose behavior contradicts every value on the wall. The silence surrounding these situations is not kindness, it's corrosion. Over time, it eats away at trust, morale, and results. Justin Hale has spent his career helping people break that silence skillfully. A master trainer and author at Crucial Learning, he is co-author with Joseph Grenny of Crucial Accountability, Proven Skills to Build Trust, Address Disappointment, and Get Results, the updated and expanded edition of the landmark work formerly known as Crucial Confrontations. The book draws on decades of research into why people fail to hold others accountable and what that failure leads to. Justin has trained leaders in a wide range of environments, from Fortune 500 companies to government agencies to nonprofits, in the art of having the conversations most people spend enormous energy avoiding. Justin Hale, welcome to Leadership.
Thank you, Roger. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, Justin, your book's original title was Crucial Confrontations. What does the shift to crucial accountability signal about how you and your colleagues have come to understand this challenge?
And we spent a decade trying to contrast what we didn't mean and what we did mean by that title.
Right. You didn't mean an ambush.
Yeah, exactly. What we really mean is, holding people accountable in those moments where they don't keep their commitments. So we definitely made a decision to say, why don't we stop having to clarify and instead actually clarify the title? So there was a move to Crucial Accountability, which has almost completely removed the question of what do you mean by these kinds of moments? And actually, to your point, these moments are so essential. I was just 2 weeks ago at a national conference with tens of thousands of people there. And we have all of our books out, offering them for free for people that are interested. And the most popular book that people pick is Crucial Accountability, because they just say that word, accountability, that title, we have those problems. And so
yeah, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. So it becomes a real hot button topic.
So why do people who are perfectly comfortable with authority in other contexts suddenly become conflict averse when it comes to holding a specific individual accountable? What's going on there?
People have a great deal of fear, and so I think with small conversations that we're having with people are fine to be in charge and tell other people what to do in a meeting. But when it comes to mistakes, when it comes to mess ups, we are deathly afraid of confrontation. We're afraid of defensiveness. We're fearful of repercussion. And so the most common response that we see to these kinds of moments is people just avoid them. That fear of what might go wrong overwhelms any amount of courage you may have started with to hold this essential conversation about a mess up.
And then when you fail to have the conversation, things don't tend to get better.
No, and yet we lie to ourselves, right? I mean, this is so common that I see. I talk with people all the time who have some performance issue with someone that they have allowed to fester for years. And you ask, why? Why would you do this? And initially they think, oh, I hope it will just take care of itself. They sweep it under the rug. They let it continue to grow and get worse. And by the time I show up on site, it's gone on for 2 years, 3 years, sometimes a decade.
Yeah.
And they would rather live with the issue of this person's poor performance for years than the uncomfortability of having to have the conversation. It just blows my mind. And yet it's incredibly common. And it's even common, Roger, in areas where you think, well, I can see how people would not want to speak up when the issue is moderately risky. But I mean, if it was life or death, of course I would speak up. And our research has shown that's not actually true. Whether it be on an oil rig or in a hospital, we find that the prevalence of silence around performance issues and mistakes is as common in these very, very high stakes environments as they are in an IT setting or a restaurant or in a home.
Well, of course, silence in the face of unmet expectations is itself a form of communication. What does it communicate?
Yeah, it communicates permissiveness. My colleague used to say, what you permit, you promote.
Yeah.
And so when you don't bring something up, you are essentially sending the message, this is okay. I'm allowing this.
Right.
And I think the message that you're sending to the person with the poor performance, yes, there are some repercussions to that, but I think even worse, when you go to silence, to your point, the message you're sending to everyone else around them is that you won't hold people to standards. And no one wants to work in an organization where there's no accountability. There are no standards. I talk to people every day who complain to me, in our organization, there's no accountability. No one's held to keep their commitments. People constantly are not doing what they say they're going to do, and they're just allowed to let slide. And so you create a culture of permissiveness and low standards. And so what ends up happening is people leave because they don't want to be in an environment like that. People want to be in an environment of high performance. They want to be in an environment where people keep their commitments. And so you actually cause a myriad of problems when you allow these things to persist.
And the situation's even worse when the bad behavior is clearly contradictory to the high-sounding values on the wall in the employee cafeteria.
Oh, it's classic. Classic example is some beautiful picture of an eagle flying and some profound statement of accountability is our motto.
Teamwork is dream work.
Yeah. You know? Other sort of platitudes that, to your point, aren't lived or used in day to day. And I think that the best cultures I've seen are ones where those posters come out of what already exists behaviorally in the organization, rather than we put the posters up first and say, hey, that's what we're all aspiring to. You've got to create the norm first. And the norm is created through, as you said, how the leader handles those moments. I had such a cool conversation recently, Roger, with this woman who is the chief people officer at this really successful restaurant group. And I loved her perspective on accountability because this was a restaurant group that was very successful in terms of their restaurants. They were top Zagat rating. Some of the restaurants have Michelin stars. These are best of the best, a lot of them in Manhattan. But what's also powerful about their organization is that they retain their employees at a really, really high level, which is uncommon in the restaurant industry.
Right.
And when you ask her, hey, tell me about how you do this. How do you accomplish it? People are curious. What do you do? And she didn't talk about success. She actually said, our success culturally has to do with how we handle failure, not when things are going well. She said, our success is about how we handle things when they're not going well. And she actually had this statement where she said, in our organization, I teach managers this motto and we live this motto. The road to success is paved with mistakes well handled. Isn't that beautiful? I just thought, wow, what a great perspective.
Yeah. Sounds like a good marriage.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Plenty of mistakes.
Yeah. Now, in your book, you introduced the concept of the accountability gap, the space between what was expected and what was delivered. How do many leaders misread that gap?
Yeah, that is a missed moment of awareness for many leaders. I think it starts actually in the moment of agreement. So many leaders are creating the performance gaps that are giving them headaches. What I mean by that is that it is incredibly common for a leader when they give someone an assignment or give someone a commitment or a job or a project, for those leaders to be overly vague about their expectations. They might say something like, hey, in the next quarter, I'd like to see you be more collaborative with marketing. Or, hey, in 2027, I'd like to see you be more of a team player with the tech team. And, the employee shakes their head and the manager feels really positive. Look at me, I'm coaching. And from that moment, when the employee walks away, the gap starts.
Yeah.
The gap between expectations and actual performance.
And that could mean going to play golf with Bob.
Yeah, exactly.
What does it mean?
There are a million interpretations out of these vague words, to your point. And so leaders miss noticing these gaps, to your point. First, when they're created, they do a poor job of creating clear expectations. They need to be more behavioral, more specific. And then the other place is, they also don't notice a gap when it hits them in the face. They just feel conflict. They feel frustration. And we encourage people to say, hey, when you're feeling frustrated, ask yourself the question, is there a gap between something that I expect and something I'm actually getting? And what is that gap that I'm either not talking about or I'm doing a poor job of talking about? It's those moments of that gap that really predict whether poor performance persists or whether we start to get things on a better road.
Well, when a gap appears between a commitment and what's actually taking place, some leaders seem to assume, first off, bad intent. What's the danger of starting there?
Now, that might be the most important tip, because the emotional attitude that a leader brings to this conversation predicts how the rest of it will go. We've talked for years, Roger, about this idea. We like to lovingly call the first 30 seconds of these accountability conversations the hazardous half minute, right? Because the first 30 seconds predicts how the rest goes. And yet, how you handle that first 30 seconds is often determined before you ever open your mouth. It's determined by the emotional attitude or emotional tenor that you bring to that conversation. Now, it goes back to the question you asked. The assumptions that we make about why the person has failed or the person has made this mistake will determine our emotional tenor. If we tell ourselves this, what we call a story, if we make this judgment that they made this mistake because they're lazy or they're selfish or they just don't care, that will drive an emotion of negativism, an emotion of judgment, an emotion of disgust. And that kind of emotion brought to an accountability discussion will only result in one thing, which is defensiveness on the part of the other person, because our delivery will be judgmental and disgusted and frustrated and emotional. And so what we teach is the importance of, when you see a gap, is to first ask yourself some key questions to open your mind to be more curious and less judgmental. Right. So one of the really cool changes that we wrote in the book that was so fun was this idea that the greatest threat to a successful conversation is disgusted certainty. Right.
Oh, yeah.
What we're looking for is determined curiosity. It doesn't mean you let people off the hook. It doesn't mean that you're permissive of poor behavior. But if you want to be successful at getting to dialogue about that gap and to hopefully close it, to help them take responsibility for their poor performance and to help them change, you've got to come with an attitude of determined curiosity rather than disgusted certainty. So ask yourself key questions. My favorite question we teach is this question: why might a reasonable, rational, decent person have messed up the way they did? Or why might a reasonable person have struggled in this performance setting or not kept the commitment that they made to me? Because when we're locked in that disgusted certainty, we don't see the person as reasonable and rational. We see them as a villain, or we see them as lazy or selfish. And so what you want to do is step back and say, let me challenge that story. Let me challenge that assumption. And the best way to challenge that certainty in your brain is to assault that certainty with questions. Come at it with things that make you go, I wonder if, maybe I could be wrong. I wonder if there's, those kinds of things.
Well, the hazardous half minute can happen even before you enter the conversation because you're challenging your stories.
That's right. And that might be the most important conversation, is the one you have with yourself.
Right.
Right. And I think the leaders who do this poorly, as they're preparing for the conversation, they are perpetuating their own stories. And actually, to kind of connect to something that's very relevant today, we're seeing more and more people use AI to help them prepare for these conversations. And there was a study that came out of Stanford just at the end of 2025 where they found that people who consult AI to help them with interpersonal conflict, AI tends to justify people's stories and make them feel even more right than before they used AI. And like I said before, the goal isn't, as you're preparing for the conversation, to feel justified or, verified. It's instead to challenge your assumptions, to open your mind, to become more curious. And actually using AI instead will often make people feel justified in their negativism.
Sure, AI behaves as a sycophant. I see a lot of landmines using AI for this kind of conversation.
Absolutely. It's the worst kind of echo chamber for people to feel self-justified in their disgusted certainty about this other person. So what all of us need in preparation for these conversations is someone or something to challenge us. Because especially if this has gone on for a long amount of time, it's likely that the stories you're telling, the negative stories you're telling about the other person, they become solidified. They become like concrete as it dries over time. And you need someone or something that's going to dislodge that, that's going to break it apart so that you can come in with an attitude, not a Pollyanna attitude of, oh, I'm sure they had a good reason or everything's fine. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that an attitude of open-mindedness to say, you know what? I actually am not certain of anything right now. I know there's a gap. We made this agreement. That's not what's happening. I'm not 100% certain if it's selfishness or they don't have the tools they need, or I have no idea. If you can come in with that kind of openness, that kind of curiosity, you can have all sorts of room to be a human and to fumble a little bit when you open the conversation. You don't have to say things perfectly because your curiosity will show on your face. And it is so much less likely that the other person will feel defensive because they'll see on your face a genuine sense of openness.
Well, collaboration is a lot better than an ambush.
Absolutely. And my favorite ambush is how leaders or parents love to do the guess what I'm thinking game.
Yeah.
They don't want to come out and just say it. They're like,
yeah.
So how was school today, Ethan? Fine.
Yeah.
Oh, well, did anything happen that you might want to talk about? No, Dad, nothing happened. Well, that's funny because I just got a call from your principal. Boom, the ambush is on, right?
Yeah,
And so when people feel ambushed, they are definitely not going to take responsibility.
And another problem with an ambush is once you do it once, even if you may repent and try to do better in the future, that's still going to be part of their memory.
Absolutely.
Well, Justin, some leaders inherit accountability gaps created by their predecessors. How can they begin to close the gap that they didn't open?
Yeah, that's a tricky moment. And leaders have to be careful because what you don't want to do is all of a sudden show up day one and start holding people accountable to something that's been allowed for years and years and years. The best steps for that kind of moment are to first, when you come in, is to reestablish the agreement again, right? This is a new contract, a new relationship contract between you, the new leader, and this existing team. It wouldn't be appropriate to just show up and start guns ablaze and go after people and say, I can't. Instead, restate the expectation of people and say, hey, no matter what's happened in the past, I want you to know from my perspective as the leader, this is what I expect. Be crystal clear about that. And then start holding people accountable from that point forward. But I think it's important to reestablish rules, not to just come in and start, holding people accountable to things they haven't been held accountable to. You sort of have to wipe the slate clean and start anew.
Yeah. Well, you describe a framework for deciding whether to address something now or to let it go. What are the key variables in that decision?
Yeah. Look, most of the time, we don't speak up when we should, right? So it's very uncommon that there are moments when we shouldn't speak up. But when deciding if I should say something, there are some key things that you want to be considering, which is, okay, is there a gap right now between expectations and performance that's legitimately important to the results or the relationship that I care about, right? And if so, then you absolutely need to talk. There are moments when you shouldn't speak up, like moments when there's no ongoing relationship. Maybe you have a gap with a vendor and this is the only time you're going to work with them. And so maybe you say, I'm not going to hold them accountable. Or maybe, the example you gave earlier, speaking up prematurely. People have not been held accountable to this up to this point. I'm not just going to come in and start holding them accountable to this expectation. Instead, I'm going to reset the expectation. Sometimes you shouldn't speak up when the gap is simply preference. if the way my wife eats watermelon bugs me, I wouldn't call that a legitimate gap that I need to hold her accountable to, right?
Yeah.
So if something is just preference, then that's not a gap and you probably shouldn't say something. Or other times, the gap is your fault. You've done a poor job of setting expectations, and so no, you shouldn't hold them accountable. So those are a couple of moments when you shouldn't speak up. But every other time, when you feel a sense of my conscience is nagging me, the results are suffering, I feel frustrated, I feel tension, I feel friction, yes, you should absolutely speak up. Now, that's the easy part. The harder part now is to say, what do I talk about? Because even people who are willing to speak up about a performance gap, they do poorly from the beginning because they talk about the wrong thing. One of my favorite movies from the 90s is Groundhog Day. Bill Murray, what a classic.
Oh, yeah, I can quote the dialogue.
Love the movie. And it also teaches this cool principle around holding these accountability discussions, which is if you find yourself like Bill Murray living Groundhog Day, feeling like when it comes to performance conversations, you're having the same conversation, AKA living the same day over and over and over again. What I like to tell leaders, and I say it pretty candidly, is I say, if that's your experience right now, the problem isn't the other person, the problem's actually you. And often I think people are taken back like, oh, how dare you blame me? And I say, no, let me clarify. Let me clarify.
We didn't pay you to come here and tell us that.
Exactly. We came for you to justify our blame of everyone else.
Yeah.
And so I push them to take responsibility and say, likely what's happening if you're living Groundhog Day in your crucial conversations is that you're holding the wrong conversation. The tool is called CPR that helps you get out of that. It stands for content, pattern, relationship. So it's a quick diagnostic tool to help you understand, why am I having the same conversation over and over again? And what's the right conversation that will get me out of this pernicious cycle of talking about the same thing with the same person? So first, what you look at and say, okay, is this a content level gap? Meaning it's the first time it's ever happened. It's a one-time problem. If so, then just talk about that one episode. Most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, we're dealing with pattern, something that's happened 3, 4, 5 times. Now, this is important to differentiate between content and pattern. The biggest mistake that leaders make when it comes to CPR is they talk about content when they should be talking about pattern. Maybe your coworker, Maya, has missed an assignment 4 times in the last month. And you go to her and say, hey, on the 4th episode, you go to her and say, hey, Maya, I want to talk to you about yesterday's deadline that you missed. And she immediately says, oh, you would not believe, Justin, what's happened. I ran into this issue and X, Y, and Z, and my computer went down. And you go, oh, well, those are legitimate reasons. Thanks for letting me know. And you move on and you feel resolved. And yet this is where you got caught. What happened there was that the real issue was the pattern. Your real concern with Maya wasn't episode number 4. Your real concern with Maya was episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4. But what she did was she pulled you back into content. She pulled you back into the more recent episode, which made you feel like, oh, we're good. And guess what's going to end up happening? You're likely going to be back in this conversation again.
Number 5.
And you're going to think it's Maya's fault, but in reality, it was you. You tried to talk about content when you should have been talking about pattern. R stands for relationship. Sometimes patterns go on long enough that a behavior starts to affect things like our trust in each other, or our ability to respect one another, or I start to question this person's competence to do their job because it's gone on for so long or it's so egregious. And so there are times when we need to hold this deepest level of a conversation, which is a relationship level conversation. It's not just about one episode. It's not even just about 3 or 4 times. It's about the fact that this behavior, this gap, is now affecting my trust in you, or my ability to respect you, or it's questioning my perception of your competence to do the job. So it's so important as any leader is deciding, do I say something? First, ask the question, what should I talk about? CPR is a great tool to help you decide what to talk about, prioritize the right issue. Second, deciding if you should talk at all. Most of the time, the answer is absolutely. Every once in a while, if it's just a preference or it's one of these one-time things and you don't have an ongoing relationship with the person, maybe you decide not to speak up. But the real problem we're trying to address here is ongoing silence, Roger.
Well, and it can help to have for lack of a term, a positive accountability conversation with Maya. When she meets the next 4 or 5 deadlines, you could tell her, I've noticed that after our previous conversation, you've met all of these deadlines. Let's talk about how helpful that is to the rest of the team and to our customers. We really appreciate it when you do that.
Yeah. Absolutely. The rewarding performance is so important. And sometimes many leaders feel like, well, that's what I pay them for.
Yeah.
And yes, that's true. But these are also human beings, not robots. And so does any human being, even though you may pay them to do a job, do you think that it matters to the relationship and, to your point, the ongoing trust between the two of you so that you can, when things do go poorly, you can talk to them in a way that they'll listen? Do you think it would matter if you said thank you? Do you think it would matter if periodically, to your point, you said, hey, I really appreciate you finishing that analysis when you did, because it got Sal the data he needed and he was able to finish his presentation to the board, and that meant a lot to him. So I really appreciate you putting in the work. And a lot of us feel like we're going easy on people if we say that because we're thanking them for doing their job. But human beings, we share one core need, which is we all want to feel important. We all want to feel a sense of self-worth in terms of that what we're doing matters. No matter who you are, no matter your personality, introvert, extrovert, everybody wants to be important. And when you feel important and someone says you're important, that goes so far in building the relationship of trust that you're going to need, because inevitably they will mess up. There will be mistakes.
Oh, sure. They're human.
Your change initiative has the budget. The strategy looks solid, and everyone's nodding along in the meetings. But for some reason, it's going nowhere. Dr. Roger Dean Duncan knows why. After 40 years in the trenches with top business leaders, he knows that change fails when organizations lack the right foundations: trust, accountability, and real communication. Dr. Duncan's free 10-minute assessment shows you exactly where your organization stands. Answer a few straightforward questions that reveal your true change readiness level. Don't waste months discovering the hard way. Get your free assessment today at leadershop.net/change. Again, that's leadershop.net/change.
I've always thought specificity is helpful. When you compliment somebody, don't just say, nice presentation. Say, nice presentation. I especially appreciated this, and this about what you did.
Yeah. I think it's the difference between recognizing the outcome of their efforts versus recognizing the specific efforts they put in to get to the outcome, to your point, right?
Right. They're more likely to repeat it.
That's right.
Well, let's consider a scenario where the gap involves something subjective, for example, attitude, effort, or energy. If you're initiating the accountability conversation, how can you describe the situation without the other person dismissing it?
Separate fact from stories.
Okay.
What I find incredibly helpful is when you want to address a gap around something that seems kind of squishy, to your point, there was always some observable fact or observation or something the other person said or did that you can utilize as a way to give them an example. Maybe it is in your mind, you're thinking the concern is their attitude. And then I would push the leader and say, okay, fair enough. There may be an attitude concern here, but let me ask you this question. Let's dig into that. What did this person say or do, or what's the pattern of things that they've said or done that's led you to the conclusion that there's an attitude problem? And they'll often give me more squishy things to start. They'll say things like, they just kind of have this selfish attitude. They're not a team player. And I say, okay, I get it. But let's push this. What did they actually do? Give me one example of something they did in a meeting or during a call or in an email that when they did that thing, that equated to you to a poor attitude. And it often will take a leader a couple minutes because what leaders are used to doing is churning around in their mind, their perceptions, their assumptions. Bad attitude is an assumption. It's a conclusion. Now, it may be valid. It may be an important part of the conversation, and yet it's different than the behavioral facts. And so as we dig into it, leaders will say, well, in our last meeting, for example, when I shared our new policy on AI, this person interrupted me and said, that's stupid. Or you know what, come to think of it, we had a meeting with our board last month and we were presenting the budget numbers and they said, I know the rest of the team agrees with these numbers, but I think they're ludicrous. And I said, great, now we're getting somewhere, right? Now we're getting to some specific examples.
Yeah.
And so if you want to share a feedback about a gap, where you think the attitude is the problem. That's okay. But don't start with saying, you have a poor attitude and I want you to fix it. Instead, start with saying, hey, I have a concern about some things I've seen. Describe those specific things. Give examples so specific that the other person is unlikely to be able to disagree because you're giving real behavioral examples. And then you can say, my concern is this reflects a poor attitude. Now you're sharing that as your own opinion. You're saying, hey, to me, this feels like a poor attitude. And it is important on our team that we have a positive attitude. What does that look like? Let me give you some behavioral examples of what I'd like to be seeing instead of what I'm seeing, right?
Yeah.
And so behind every squishy thing, there's always going to be something that the leader has observed. And our goal is to get to that thing.
Well, if you start out by saying you have an attitude problem, that guarantees an argument and defensiveness.
No question.
So you recommend an important diagnostic question. Is the accountability failure a motivation problem or an ability problem? Why does getting that wrong invariably lead to bad outcomes?
The skills we've talked to up to this point are going to get you a really long way, right? If you master your story and come with curiosity, if you are clear on the expectation, if you state facts, I find that 90% of the time you're going to get to a great dialogue. But there's a second level of this conversation. Once the dialogue ensues, the person begins to share what's happened, what's gone on, what's contributed to the gap. Now, as a leader, you've got to have a 200 level accountability skills in that moment to do what we call diagnose.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're doing is, as you begin this beautiful, healthy dialogue and they're saying, okay, yeah, that's fair. I did miss the deadline, or is the pattern? And they start talking about why. Your job is to listen. What are you listening for?
Right.
You insinuated this, right? Two things. Are they saying that the gap exists because, one, there's a motivation issue, that something to the effect of they had other priorities they were more interested in, they didn't want to do it, they don't like it, it's painful, it's not enjoyable, I don't want to do it? Or is the gap a function of an ability issue? I ran into barriers. I didn't get the data from so-and-so. I don't know exactly how to do it. I lack some of the skills and ability. I don't have the perfect experience to be very efficient at doing this. So it's taking me a lot longer than it should. Or, I didn't have access to that. And so I'm waiting for someone else to get me the password. Those kinds of things are ability concerns. Now, does it mean it's impossible? No. It's often ability difficulties. But those are enough of a barrier to prevent people from performing the way they should and the time that they should. And so the diagnostic piece as a leader is, as we begin the conversation, I begin to listen. I'm sitting there thinking, what am I hearing? Am I hearing ability concerns? Am I hearing motivation concerns? Am I hearing a combination of the two? Because what we've discovered after looking at 60 years of social science is that those two questions are really the large umbrella that explain human behavior as a whole. Human beings do what they do for positive or negative, for good or for bad, based on whether they're motivated to do it and whether they can do it. And it's either one or both of those things that determining behavior or lack of behavior. So as a leader, you've got to be thinking motivation or ability, or both. What am I hearing here? And if you can diagnose well, rather than having a myopic view of that every gap must be because they don't care, aka
Right.
motivation. If you can be more holistic about your diagnosis, you are going to be significantly more effective at actually then closing that gap because you'll know how to solve the problem.
Sure. Could be they don't have the right tools.
Yep.
So what are the most common ways people undermine an accountability conversation in the first 60 seconds? You talk about the hazardous half minute. Let's talk about the first 60 seconds. What's the minefield?
The minefield for leaders begins with, I hinted at this a minute ago, which is starting with your emotions or conclusions rather than facts. If you begin by saying something like, you're just not cutting it, or your attitude stinks, you're going to put them into defensiveness, as you mentioned. That's the first minefield you want to watch out for. If you start with facts, hey, I've been noticing these things, I saw this in the last couple of meetings, or I've been observing this, that's much more likely to start the conversation on an even emotional place. The second minefield is defensiveness. This is the one that everyone's most fearful of. It's the one that people are most scared of and they are the least skilled to manage. Maybe I do a good job of starting. Maybe I actually do state facts and I ask a very inviting question. Hey, I just want to check in. How you doing? What's going on? Can you help me understand? And then what we get back in that first 60 seconds is, how can you do this to me? Or, don't start blaming me, or don't start pointing fingers, or even worse, we get silence. They fold their arms, they sit back in their chairs, they say, oh, I'm fine. And their defensiveness manifests itself in either silence or verbal violence. And so it's managing that ultimate landmine of defensiveness that becomes maybe the greatest challenge in the middle of a conversation for a leader.
You point out that the goal of the accountability conversation is not to win, it's to solve. How do you hold on to that goal when the other person starts to get defensive?
Yeah. I actually would even adjust that a little bit, in that the goal of holding these conversations is actually the initial goal. The short-term goal is not actually accountability and change. The initial goal of these conversations is connection.
Yeah, understand.
Some people might feel like, oh, here we go, rolling their eyes, we're going to get all lovey-dovey here and hold hands and sing song. No, let me explain what I mean.
Kumbaya.
Yeah, exactly. What I mean by this is, when your first job in holding these conversations is to help people feel psychologically safe, that doesn't mean comfortable. It means that they feel like they can be honest with you back and forth and not fear that they will be blamed for their honesty. That's what psychological safety really means.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking to someone about a mistake, your job is to help them feel like you can be honest and I can be honest and there's not going to be no repercussions. When people feel safe, they embrace truth that you're trying to share with them. And when they embrace that truth, they start to feel empathy for those they've affected by their poor behavior. And when they feel that empathy, they are much more likely to take responsibility and want to change and want to fix the situation. Now, do people always take responsibility when they feel safe? No, but they will never take responsibility if they don't feel safe. And so your job is to connect with them at the beginning of the conversation, not to say we're buddies or hold hands. Instead, it's connect with them by helping them understand and trust your intentions. We find that people rarely get defensive about what you're saying. They get defensive about why they think you're saying it. They get defensive because their perception is that you're out to get them. Right. Their perception is you're trying to shame them. You're trying to blame them. So you've got to connect with them emotionally by helping them understand you can trust me. You can trust my intent. Two ingredients to this that I find to be incredibly poignant. First, they've got to trust that you care about what they care about. We call this mutual purpose. They've got to believe you care about their problems, their struggles, their successes, their failures, their agenda. And if they don't believe that you care about what they care about, they tighten up, they get defensive, they back up, they start to attack, right? They don't trust you and there's no connection. They will disconnect. The second thing they have to believe about your intent is that you respect them and or care about them as a person. And when they believe these two things about your intent, they relax, their shoulders come down, they stop feeling a need to protect themselves. Now, it doesn't mean they'll always agree, but it is much more likely that they will take responsibility and hear you and absorb that feedback when they feel that connection and that truth. And so the fruit of that connection and you being able to share truth is accountability, is fixing the problem to your point. But if your short-term goal is accountability, you will skip connection. Right. And you are, ironically, less likely to actually get accountability in the long run. And so one of the things that was beautiful, Joseph wrote this portion when we were co-authoring the book. He wrote this portion that was one of my favorite additions. He said that people don't fear truth. And he said that because when I talk to leaders all the time about defensiveness, they say, well, I don't want to give that person feedback because they just don't want to hear the truth. They can't handle the truth, right? And Joseph poignantly says, people don't fear truth, they fear shame. And so when you approach accountability as a leader in a way that provokes shame, they disconnect. And what that means is that the shame isn't just about them feeling like you despise them as their leader, but they start despising themselves. They start feeling overly guilty and shameful. That kind of emotion does not compel responsibility. It does not drive change. It drives resentment. It drives closing in on yourself. It makes people feel bad. So your job is connection through safety so that they can hear the truth and so they can take responsibility.
Well, and this connection you talk about doesn't just happen in the so-called accountability conversation. It needs to be an ongoing thing. When you enter that conversation that potentially could be uncomfortable, there should already be a relationship of trust and caring.
I love that. There's two big points that I love to your point I want to add. The late, great Stephen Covey used to say, you can't talk your way out of something you've acted yourself into.
Yeah.
And so to your point, if you're holding these accountability conversations and saying, oh, my intent is X, Y, and Z, but then your behavior is saying the opposite, your behavior will speak much louder.
Oh, yeah.
So that's essential. The second point that I love that's spurring in my mind from what you said is that these conversations shouldn't be these once a year, built up,
right,
sort of formal, traditional, here we go, it's time for performance conversations. No. You should be having these conversations for positive, to your point earlier of, hey, you're doing a great job here and there and there. I love that you're doing this, and feedback on where they can improve all year long.
Oh, sure.
If people are surprised when they get to the inevitable formal performance review conversation, which they'll have to have, and they'll have to do the paperwork for HR, always, all of us have to do it. But if when they get to that conversation, if they are surprised at all, that's on the leader. The leader has done a poor job.
Sure. Now, Justin, you have beautiful children, and my guess is if one of them makes a mistake, you don't say, we'll take that up at your quarterly review. You talk to them right then.
That's right.
And they leave hopefully feeling pretty good about that conversation.
Yeah, that's the goal. And I think it goes back to something we talked about at the beginning, is that we're fearful of the repercussions, so we don't talk about conversations, even when they're small.
Yeah.
So we sweep them under the rug, they grow and they fester. And then by the time we have to talk about them, they're so big, then they are legitimately scary and difficult to talk about. They're no longer a content conversation about one missed deadline. They are now about respect and trust. And I ask people all the time, what would you rather have to talk about? A missed assignment or how you don't trust someone?
Yeah.
Easy answer.
I mean, we talk about patterns. It works both ways. It's not just the other person, it's the leader. So how much follow-up is appropriate before it starts to feel like surveillance?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that there is accountability that needs to take place after the accountability conversation. If not, you're going to create a whole nother gap. But you also don't want to come off, to your point, as overly formal. If I'm having this conversation, I don't always want to stop and say, well, let's take a minute and let me document who's going to do what by when and how we'll follow up. Now, you want that to be accomplished. I'm not poo-pooing that desire. But I also think you want it to be a relationship where you can just talk. You can go back and forth.
Sure.
And so let's say I have a conversation with Maya about her pattern of missing deadlines, and we come to a great conversation about what's getting in the way, and we address those barriers, and she feels better, and we have a plan. I might say something like, hey, I'm really glad we talked about this, and I really appreciate you in talking me through what you're running into. What would be most helpful for you? Because it's important to me that we make sure that this changes. And I know you want to see a change. Do you want to check back in with me and report back on how things are going on our next one-on-one, which is in a week? Or do you want me to check back in with you periodically to see what would be most comfortable and less invasive for you? So sometimes I like to leave it to the other person. I'm not leaving it up to them to decide if there's accountability or not. I'm leaving it up to them to decide which would be more comfortable for you, which would feel less, awkward for you, those kinds of things. I also think, though, that it can be very important to document things in an informal way. I had a manager who did this brilliantly, and it was more on the front end of an accountability. Whenever there was a new agreement that was made, she and I would have a conversation, especially agreements that had some complexity. And we'd have a long conversation about it, and then she would send me an email or like a message on Slack or something like that right after our meeting and said, hey, just to be super, super clear, here's what you and I talked about in some of the deadlines. Is this how you saw the expectation as well? And if you saw it differently, please clarify. Let's make sure we're on the same page here, because I don't want you to feel confused, and I want to make sure I've been crystal clear about what I'm looking for. I found that to be incredibly helpful, because that wasn't micromanaging for me. It was actually doing me a favor, because it was increasing the likelihood that I would fulfill the commitment because I would know what it actually was.
Sure. And the other person would hopefully feel good about that kind of interaction.
That's right.
Well, final question, Justin. You and your colleagues have spent decades studying crucial conversations and crucial accountability. What has changed, if anything, about how most people engage with these skills, and what has stubbornly stayed pretty much the same?
The thing that has stubbornly stayed the same over the last 2 decades that I've been doing this is that we do poor math. When we're faced with a crucial conversation, whether it be just a disagreement or whether it's an accountability discussion where someone is messed up, when we're deciding if we should say something or not, we start to do a calculation in our brain. Is it worth it? Is what we're essentially calculating. And that calculation starts to include, okay, if I say something, what does that mean? Well, it's going to be uncomfortable. It might be a confrontation. It might get defensive. We start to emphasize all these short-term costs of speaking up. What we de-emphasize or often don't include in our calculations at all are all the long-term costs of not speaking up. And that is something that has been stubborn in people's minds over the last 20 or 30 years, is that people still choose silence over honesty so often. And we still continue to see that problem, whether it be, I remember we started this 30 years ago, but in the recent history, we were doing an interview with a nurse manager who said, I've got a gap with a nurse who works for me. She said, this nurse is dangerously incompetent. These are her words.
Whoa.
It's like, whoa. And this nurse manager, when describing how she handles it, she went on to say, well, what I do to address it is I send in other nurses after her to double check all of her work after she's done with the patient. It's like, oh my gosh, right? So this wasn't 50 years ago. This was recently, right? And we think about Deepwater Horizon and that BP oil spill in the Gulf. I mean, that was in the recent history. That wasn't 50, 60 years ago. And so much of what happened there was skirted processes and silence around safety issues. And so I think that's been the most persistent problem around these conversations. What I will say, though, that is better is that the tools available to help us handle these conversations effectively are more ubiquitous than they've ever been, whether it be tips on YouTube or books or audiobooks or podcasts. They are all within an easy reach to be able to help us all become more confident. And Roger, that's been my experience. It's not that people can't get better. If you weren't born with this, which most of us aren't, it's that your confidence and your sense of I can speak up comes from your competence, your skill level.
Yeah.
And if you can listen to podcasts like yours, practice a little bit, really try to improve your skills, not just gain knowledge, but skill building, you can become great at these conversations. You can have been born in a family that was terrible, and you can turn out to be an accountability master if you practice these skills.
If you want your people to grow, you need to deal with your own discomfort and step forward to have the conversations.
Absolutely.
Well, Justin Hale, thank you so much for joining us on Leadership. The insight at the heart of crucial accountability is both simple and quietly radical. The most compassionate thing a leader can do is tell the truth. Avoiding hard conversations doesn't spare people from pain, it just delays it, compounds it, and strips them of the chance to grow. In a culture increasingly allergic to discomfort, Justin and his colleagues offer something rare: a rigorous, humane framework for holding people to their word without sacrificing the relationship. The real measure of a leader, it turns out, isn't how they perform when everything goes right. It's what they say and how they say it when something goes wrong. To learn more about Justin and his work, go to cruciallearning.com. Share this episode with your friends and associates. Be sure to leave a review of our podcast. Even a single sentence fuels the algorithms that promote the great content that the Leadership podcast provides. And for free resources to help you in your leadership journey, go to leadership.net. That's leadership.net. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.